Okay, here we are. Happy World Tutors Day. We are live on LinkedIn and on YouTube and going to Spotify. I'm here with our new safeguarding partner, the wonderful Nicole Williamson, who you're going to hear lots about. But before we do any of that, I need to wish you, if you are a tutor, or you are a parent who is using tutors, or if you are a student who has benefited from the support of from a tutor, and frankly, since there's 1 in 3 of our young people working with tutors nowadays, odds are you're one of those people. Happy World Tutors Day, and thank you. Thank you for participating in this wonderful journey of learning that is gentle and personalized and helpful and rehabilitative, because not every learning experience is like that, as we know. So with that preamble, here we are with our wonderful Nicole Williamson, who has come to us from ECP Safeguarding. We're going to be talking about safeguarding in tutoring. Now, Nicole, I don't know if I told you this, but when I first started creating training for tutors, and there wasn't much out there at the time, this was 2019, all the way pre-COVID, I contacted the NSPCC and I said, do you have anything for tutors? And they said, what? So it was very new news at that time. And I think we've seen a lot of progress since then. So over to you. Welcome. Good morning.
Good morning. Lovely to be here with you today.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm going to kick off with my first question.
Hmm.
I've seen these questions in advance, so hopefully no curveballs for you. But the first question is, can you tell us a bit about your background, Nicole, and what brought you into safeguarding training, please?
Sure. Yeah, of course. So, hi, everyone. Lovely to be here with you today. And let me start by saying happy World Tutors Day. And we're delighted to be partnering and supporting you with your safeguarding journey. I mean, just a little bit about who I am. So, my career spans local authority, private, voluntary and community sector organisations and education establishments. But I've specialised in the area of safeguarding for the last 15 years, and I'm delighted to be leading ECP Safeguarding. One of the things when I met with Julia and the team at Qualified Tutor that really resonated with me was the passion for tutoring, and that was equally balanced with our passion for safeguarding and ultimately the need to ensure that that is bespoke. So it's interesting, Julia, when you say what was out there, actually what's available, we recognise that services are unique and tutoring is unique as well, and we need to ensure that the training meets your requirements. So ECP stands for Empower, Care, Protect. And in everything that we do, that's what we hope to achieve. And certainly that's going to be the journey that we're taking with you.
That's right. And it really does feel like a journey, doesn't it? And it feels slightly pioneering, which is a thing that we're quite used to and very, very glad to continue with you. So I think the next question is, why does safeguarding matter just as much in tutoring as it does in schools?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And what I'd firstly say is safeguarding is essential regardless of the organisation setting or what you do. So people will often hear me say, if you have sight or sound of a child under 18 in the voluntary or paid capacity that you undertake, you have a role to play. So I'd say it extends beyond why does it matter as much in tutoring as it does in schools. You have a duty of care. You have a unique opportunity to engage with children, their families, and potentially maybe the first person who recognises an indicator of risk. And if we think about tutoring, actually, tutoring is often happening or may happen outside of a formal institution structure. So there's different signs, different indicators. Both children and families respond and behave in different ways in different environments. One-to-one working often leads to a higher likelihood of disclosure, of relationship building, of development. So actually what that enables is potentially conversations to happen, recognition to occur. And I want to balance that, Julia, with saying, actually, I feel there's opportunity, which is enhanced within the tutoring space. But I also want to recognise that there's enhanced vulnerability as well. I'm conscious there's colleagues on the line who possibly work without an infrastructure, may not be part of a wider organisation. They're independent. And we recognise that actually in tutoring, there may be a heightened vulnerability around being a professional based on the way in which we work, and also that heightens children's vulnerability as well. So yeah, does it matter? Absolutely. And what we need to consider is the uniqueness of safeguarding in tutoring to ensure tutors are keeping themselves safe and having absolute clarity on how they respond should they have a concern about a child or indeed their wider family.
Very well said, Nicole. Those the proximity creates vulnerability, doesn't it? In every direction. We're right at the sharp end of things, and if we're not supported, then yes, we can feel very vulnerable. And that's what we do here. We make sure that we sort of buffer. We create those buffers that a teacher would have in school. We create those buffers for tutors. And one of those things will be being able to contact you and say, this is what's going on. What do you think?
Mm.
Kind of thing we're hoping to achieve together, yes?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a couple of elements there, which is around knowing what to do if you're worried and if you have that nagging doubt, having clarity on next steps, but always being professionally curious. Every situation we're in, we need to believe it could happen here, because I'm sure there's a range of families that we're working with, a range of situations that we're in, and we need to go into every situation with that reflection of what could be happening for a child.
I think every time I've completed safeguarding training, and I'm actually doing your DSL training next week.
Fabulous.
um, every time I walk away with a sort of, you sort of go into a state of heightened awareness that could almost feel like paranoia, and then settles into a sort of level of alertness and vigilance that we really want to achieve. And that's sort of what the top ups and the updates will do. They'll continue to keep you vigilant.
Yeah, absolutely. In line with the latest trends, Julia, which I think is important to mention. We're working in such an evolving area of safeguarding. Guidance documents 10 years ago used to be 30 pages long. The average is now 180 because there's so much to consider.
I was hoping you'd say a one-sheeter.
Well, I mean, that's the aim of our sessions, that we simplify and bring to life what may be some quite arduous documents for people to review. So we'll certainly be doing that.
When you told me your story about how, when you and I first chatted and you told me how you really started with ECP, I really got a sense that your training is going to be spectacular. And I'm expecting that experience next week. So let's move on to part two of our conversation here, which is understanding the lay of the land, the landscape in tutoring. And I'd love to know whether you've already got an idea of what some of the blind spots might be in tutoring.
Sure.
And don't forget to speak about online.
Yeah, of course, of course. I mean, blind spots are interesting because I think this is going to be unique to each tutoring circumstance. Because if I think about, I might be a tutor within an institution, a school as an example. I may be completely independent. I may be inviting children into my home. I may be visiting homes. I may be tutoring in an open space. So I think I'll start there around blind spots, which is, what's absolutely imperative is to risk assess the environment within which you are conducting your services. So that's the first element. And online, of course, is you're inviting on a one-to-one basis a child into an environment with you. So I'd firstly say, reflecting on where your sessions happen, when they happen, and ensuring that those risk assessments are done around those environments. So that's the first thing, the assessment of risk. The second thing that underpins an effective assessment of risk are clear policies, procedures, and recording systems. Now, they don't have to be lengthy. They don't have to be challenging documents. Actually, the more simplified they are, the better. Clarity on, here are the expectations of our engagement. This is what I commit to. This is, as a family, what we expect you to commit to. And these are the expectations. And what will I do if certain situations arise? So risk assessment can only be effective if you've got the foundation of really clear policies, procedures, and record keeping.
So because that's lovely. The thinking that has to happen, the preparation that has to happen before you are in any kind of tutoring context is that key bit, isn't it? And we, of course, there's so much alignment here. We talk about professionalism and our certification process, which I know I've walked you through in the past, where asking tutors to reflect on their policies and procedures is an absolute game changer for them. And so many tutors have told me that they feel more comfortable simply by answering the questions for themselves, by knowing that they're written down somewhere. And sometimes it's the things like, am I going to get paid? What are my cancellation policies? But at the most important, at the foundational level, what am I going to do if I'm worried about one of my students? That's really what we're talking about here.
Yeah, absolutely. And almost there's a preventative measure first step of that, which is what will I put into place to safeguard myself and the student? And then the second part of the policy is, and what do I do if I have a nagging doubt, a concern, an incident, an issue has arisen? And that's where record keeping comes in. You know, we see some practice where information may be held on emails, on bits of paper. Actually, what you need to ensure is that you have a recording system that captures information as required, that you're holding that in line with data protection. So the good news is, Julia, we've created a summary of all of the expectations. We've recorded a podcast around meeting statutory guidance. So, you know, people might be sitting thinking, this feels a lot. Actually, undertake the foundations robustly, and then annually you're just reviewing them. So get it right at the start, and that will be your foundation that you continue to build on, and then it becomes second nature.
Well, that's really, really good timing, because so many tutors wisely use the summer to do that foundation work. And so, you know, that opportunity, because you're right, it does sound like a lot. And so many of us in tutoring are really not excited about paperwork.
Yeah, I think I'm one of the only people who get excited about writing robust policies. So I really,
yeah, I can see your tail wagging there. We have one member who's obsessed with spreadsheets, and she, you know, honestly, you just see her light up when she talks about a spreadsheet. And I am not that person, so I need you to guide me to make something very, very simple that I can feel does exactly what it needs to do. No bells, no whistles, just really simple and unfussy. And those of us who are, and there's a lot of neurodiversity in the tutoring community, and that needs to be factored in also, that the communication has to be clear and explicit and not too overwhelming.
Yeah, and unique to your individual circumstance as a tutor, because everybody will be operating in a different way with students with different needs in different circumstances. So it needs to be unique to you. So the other thing I often say to people is, of course, take a template, you know, that's a great foundation, but stop and reflect. Actually, does this meet the needs for me? And that's what's really important.
Yeah, you know, as you described all the different modalities in which we might be working as a tutor, I'm thinking all of the above. You know, I can be in one day going into a school, working online with a student, working on behalf of an agency, and having students come into my home. And that's wonderful. It's what I love about the job. But it does mean that I have to have a whole series of risk assessments.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And there's absolutely commonality. My response when I am concerned is the same regardless of the environment I've operated in, but almost that preventative, protective factor is going to differ dependent on the environment, which, as you say, the risk assessment's the foundation for that.
Fantastic. Okay, so let's move on to my next question, which is, how have expectations changed in recent years? And how can tutors stay up to date? And I'm excited because I know that you have an enormous amount of resource sitting behind you to help us with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the first reflections that I would have is that I would say historically there was a belief that tutors were within education establishments. So they were linked with schools, you know, they are teachers in schools, therefore they're always up to date. And actually, that's not the reality of the landscape now. You know, as a tutor, I may not be within an education establishment on a formal basis, meaning I'm getting all my training, all my updates, all my information, which I'm able to carry across. So the first thing that I'd say is, as tutors, we need to make sure that we are up to date. And what has progressed significantly is we have very clear out of school setting guidance that's produced by the government. Now, it's defined as non-statutory, and the reason for that is that there isn't a regulatory body ensuring its implementation, but the guidance is clear. This should be followed by tutors who are operating directly with students. So that's the expectation. So the first thing that I would say is the key changes that we have now is clarity within a framework. So, for example, that guidance is absolutely explicit that as a tutor, you must have a written safeguarding and child protection policy. You must keep yourself up to date with safeguarding issues that affect children and families and be appropriately and suitably trained. If you are an independent tutor, you are also the designated safeguarding lead. You wear every hat if you are one individual. So you've got to consider the levels of training that you undertake. And it's also really clear, and actually this is also legislative within the legal framework, you've got to know where you share information and when. And that often is founded within your policy and within your training. So there's two elements around the guidance, looking at your infrastructure, but also your suitability. So thinking about the recruitment process, ensuring that you have clarity around your own code of conduct, that you have relevant levels of DBS checks, that you know what to do if concerns arise or allegations are made against you, that you follow the statutory procedures that are outlined. And I'm conscious we may also have organisations here who support a range of tutors, that you have low-level concerns procedures, that you manage performance, that you undertake reviews. So I'd say how the landscape has changed is that we have clarity, that we have an infrastructure, that actually we have a framework that we can lean into. And I think this has such an impact, Julia, because if I was a parent looking for a tutor, I'm looking for a tutor that outlines that they have all of that in place. You know, actually, that tells me that this is someone or an organisation who understands the expectations and will keep my child safe within this environment. So, yeah, the landscape is around clarity of guidance, but equally ensuring that you're keeping yourself up to date. And there's so many avenues now to do that. I think that's been a big shift. Saying I don't know and I didn't know where to go isn't a response anymore, because there are so many places and spaces to access this information.
Absolutely. Absolutely right. That last point that you made about taking responsibility is really what we have to do as a professional tutor, because nobody's going to do it for us, except you and I have 6 sessions scheduled for the coming year. And we have those schedules, the Inset for Tutors program, which we're running across next year, will feature Nicole and ECP bringing safeguarding updates 6 times in the year. And I've described to you that we'll be starting every session with safeguarding, because safeguarding comes first. And therefore, if our members or anybody who wants to opt into the Inset for Tutors program, either as an organization or as an independent tutor, can come in and make sure that they stay on top of their training. And I can tell you from experience that the confidence that comes from being sure that you're competent is a game changer and has palpable effect on the relationships you have with the families that you work with. So your students will actually have a better time if you are better qualified. And safeguarding is the beginning of that. Now, I was really surprised that your answer to what's changed in recent years was clarity, because the world feels more complicated than ever. Social media, mental health, emotional-based school absence, home education. There are so many changes that are affecting every aspect of our young people's lives right now. And so the fact that your answer was, we have clear frameworks for inside school and outside school, felt very reassuring.
Yeah. And I mean, to add to your point there, Julia, this is where the insights are going to be so powerful. Also, we don't know what we don't know. You've just listed a number of areas of potential vulnerability there. And what we need to have is the time and space to explore those, to understand what the indicators may be and how that may present and how we may support or respond effectively. So, yeah, we've got clarity in the framework, but the framework will only be effective if we have confidence in our recognition and assessment of risk. Really? So that's what's imperative. If we've got that awareness level there, then we've got the procedures to implement.
Right, really nice. So that idea about time and space, which I am so passionate about in tutoring, you know, in training, I participated in training last week, which was chalk and talk. There were 40 experts in the room and somebody spoke at us, which is so disappointing, because that's not what good training feels like.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, yeah, we're going to work through lots of case studies. We're going to think about how do we ensure your safeguarding culture within your tutoring environment is at the highest quality it can be. And Julia, what really resonated with what you just said there is it's going to lead to better outcomes for your students, because also you'll have confidence around the approach that you're undertaking, and confidence should challenging circumstances arise. And we've got to think that they may do. And that's often a point of, actually, I've now got to use the policy that maybe I wrote 9 months ago, and today is the day I respond. And we need to have confidence in those moments.
Yeah, and we also need to have confidence that we're not alone.
Yeah.
So certainly within the QT community, you can, within, the realms of confidentiality and appropriateness, you can ping the group and say, this is what's going on. Or you can participate in our supervision circles, and you can actually brainstorm in a sort of mastermind type context. What do I do in this case? And you and I have discussed the importance of Q&A within our Inset for Tutor program, because what we'll find is a co-creation. We'll find that as a community, we will describe the best ways of doing things that work for us. And you will be our leader in the context of what the framework advises, but also how to move through that framework and make it practical.
Yeah, exactly. Because no situation is the same. If I could give you a checklist of answers, that would be ideal. That's what everybody wants in safeguarding. But actually, what we have to do is develop confidence over time. Are there still situations where people even approach me and say, can I just talk this through? And we work through the response, because there's not just an answer that I could pick up a document and say, this is what you do. We work through the rationale, we understand the risk, and we look at the outcomes that have children at the centre of our decision making. So we'll certainly develop those skill sets within the Inset days.
That's really exciting because of the feeling of safety. You spoke before about tutors feeling vulnerable, and I think that this is quietly one of the things that worries us most.
Yeah.
Let's move on to our next question. So I actually have some practical scenarios, and I thought, if you wouldn't mind, just sort of we'll roll through them together and see if we can understand some of the principles sitting behind them. Would that be okay?
Of course. Yeah.
The first scenario is this: if a student messages something worrying late at night, how should a tutor respond, especially if they're not sure who to report it to? So, it's, what would the worrying thing be? It would be what the channel for the message would be. It would be why late at night, and does that make a difference? And then that question about why does the tutor not already know who to report it to? What are your thoughts?
So I looked at this and thought it was a trick question, Julia, because my immediate response was, I'd be reflecting upon my code of conduct and recognizing that as a tutor, I shouldn't have direct messaging capacity with a student. So in order to safeguard myself, in order to safeguard the student, all contact should be undertaken via parents. So actually, if I'm meeting in the online domain, if I'm meeting in real life, the communication, the arrangement is happening directly with a parent who holds parental responsibility.
So let me dive in there. Let me dive in there, because my kids who are 16 and older communicate with their tutors directly. And I very often am on the WhatsApp group and observing, but I don't get involved, because my task as a parent is to adult my children. I need them to learn how to advocate and to plan. So they don't need me to ping the tutor and say, this is what we need. They need me to pay.
Yeah, sure.
But actually, part of the process of working with a tutor can be learning how to communicate appropriately.
Yeah, absolutely. So the second part of my response was going to be, it also depends on the age of the student, because actually social media sites have very clear age restrictions. There's absolute clarity around how old you should be in order to, so you mentioned 16 there. So when you think about platforms such as WhatsApp, you're of the age where you are able to engage on that platform. So with parental consent, that may be a communication mechanism that is approved and deemed as a circumstance that can be implemented. So the other element of this is, so let's say there's a reasonable expectation around how that communication has occurred. Late at night is worrying, because actually that heightens the vulnerability. Actually, is this a cry for help? It's challenging when we don't know what's been said. But the first thing that I would say is, as a tutor, if I receive a message and I am worried about a child, I must act within that situation. So my first reflection is, dependent on my relationship with the parent and dependent on whether it places the child at risk by communicating with the parent, that would be my first port of call in relation to contact and next steps. If I believe there is risk to life, then I'm contacting the police. If I believe that a child is at risk of significant harm and that may not be imminent, I'm contacting children's social care. Now, all of these contact details are available publicly. I mean, the police is 999, so that's simple. But let's say, for example, I'm based in Hertfordshire. If I go onto the Hertfordshire Safeguarding Children's Partnership, I'm able to find the contact number, which is 24/7, where I could pick up the phone and speak to a professional to say, I'm in receipt of information. I need some advice around how to respond. I am worried about the communication that I'm in receipt of. But ultimately, your assessment of risk is the child currently safe? Is there any imminent, immediate risk of harm, especially harm to life? And undertaking a response to ensure that whether that's parent, children's social care, or the police, based on your risk assessment, you've undertaken that response.
The only stakeholder that I haven't heard you mention would be the DSL at school. So the designated safeguarding lead at the child's school. And we do usually say it's worthwhile getting the details of the child's school during their onboarding process.
Yeah.
Does that seem like the right thing to do?
If it was a daytime, absolutely. If it's in the day, you've got DSL support, whereas late at night, you're not going to have a DSL on call or have someone's personal information as a DSL in school in order to respond. So, yeah, I think that's a variable. But if it was the daytime, definitely. But late at night, what we always say is, please don't wait until there is someone that you can speak to. If I'm worried now and I believe there's a risk of significant harm, now is the point that I act. And that's what's absolutely imperative. But equally, Julia, I'm considering I might be a tutor working for a tutoring organisation. So actually, there may be an infrastructure that is available for me to communicate with as well. So that's also an option that's available.
A structure and also a process that you would need to follow if that was the case. I think it's also worth sort of unpicking what might be the message. The student message is something worrying late at night. Yeah, it could be something about tomorrow's schedule, but we've said it's something worrying.
Yeah.
So there's a sort of sensitivity to, is it simply this child that the child is saying, I don't feel like I can have a session tomorrow. I don't feel well enough. And then you're hearing mental health alarms. Or is there something more around, I'm not feeling safe?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's where your assessment of risk comes in. Do I need to respond now due to risk of significant harm? Or is it appropriate for me to wait until the following morning and touch base with a designated lead to communicate directly with parents, whatever the case may be? So this is where confidence in assessment of risk is absolutely imperative in relation to what's being shared.
And then also there's the confidence in your code of conduct, which you referred to right at the beginning, which is, a gentle nudge to the student to say, I'm really happy to hear from you in these ways at these times, but obviously not in that moment. So you wouldn't respond at nighttime when the student has some sort of heightened issue. You wouldn't respond with, I'm not available to you right now, but certainly you'd carve out some time at the beginning of the next session, maybe, to lay out the correct ways of communicating with you.
And also the preventative element is that at the start of any tutor relationship with a student, that's one of the elements that we outline. How do we communicate with each other? What are the boundaries of that? And actually don't expect me to respond. So I can think of an incident I supported with last year where the communication happened, but the boundaries hadn't been absolutely explicit. And the professional found themselves in quite a challenging situation dealing with something in the middle of the night because they reflected on, actually, it's quite reasonable that that student expected me to respond in that moment in time because I hadn't said, I'm not available. Don't expect a response from me in the middle of the night because I don't have access to my device or I may not be responding at that moment in time. So the preventative measure is the clarity, because children will reach out to people they believe will respond. And if we're absolutely clear on those parameters, then, children's responses will differ.
I love that you had this exact scenario in real life last
Mm.
year. I think that's really interesting. And I love that reflective process of the person who realized that they couldn't blame the child because they hadn't communicated effectively. I also think that tutors really are so committed to making sure that we have a helpful rapport with the child and with the family, that we are quite mindful of how proper to be. So creating boundaries without creating distance, creating boundaries within which everybody feels safe, is actually quite a skill, because getting the balance right between being proper and being standoffish can be quite tricky. And
Yeah.
then there are cultural nuances. So if you're working with families in, all across the world, then again, there will be certain norms that you'll need to pick up on.
Yeah, and I suppose that also changes the timings as well. What maybe my daytime is different if I'm working on a global basis.
Brilliant.
Interestingly, Julia, one of the outcomes that we identified within that case, because there was an investigation around it, was that the individual identified that they wanted to safeguard themselves by also differentiating what is their personal communication mechanisms and what is their professional. And actually, what they did was it ended up with two SIMs with two numbers, and they only switched on their professional SIM during working hours when they were in operation, when they were engaged with students. So it's also about ensuring that you're clear on your own boundaries and what you feel comfortable with, and ensuring that they're maintained. So
I
if you're
love that
saying,
thinking, because it's
mm,
it's almost like the sort of social work volunteer sector type thinking, isn't it? Of, I'm working very closely with a vulnerable person here, and therefore I have to have my systems, and two telephones makes a lot of sense in that case.
yeah,
It's just not the kind of thing that we have to think of as educators usually, and bringing that into our thinking is is a really profound change in our disciplines.
yeah. And ultimately, children need boundaries, and actually, they turn to professionals who are boundaried, who are clear, who, when we talk about managing disclosures when there are concerns, what we often find is children turn to those for whom they have absolute clarity with. Actually, where there's ambiguity of an adult who's deemed as a friend, who's available at any time, where the boundaries aren't clear, actually we see more challenging circumstances. So there's absolute benefits in safeguarding yourself, but also for the child. You're then seen as that trusted adult. It
So
provides
well
all of those
put.
qualities.
We very often talk about the importance of trust as the
Mm,
as the catalyst for learning, and really doing this work and this thinking makes you a more trustworthy adult.
absolutely, absolutely.
Let's go on to the next scenario. I'm really
Mm,
enjoying this conversation. So, what should a tutor do if something unsafe or inappropriate appears in the background during an online session? So, you and I have very intentionally planned backgrounds here, a
mhm.
clear wall, not too complicated, not too overwhelming, not too distracting, but also entirely appropriate. So, what could those inappropriate things be, or unsafe things appearing in the background? They could be a person, it
Yep.
could be any kind of content that would be deemed inappropriate to the young person at that age. I'm sorry, I'm doing your job for you. Go ahead.
No, no, no. It's helpful. I mean, it's interesting because again, there's so many circumstances that this could be. I mean, to give you another example of a case that occurred, and actually this was during COVID, that a tutor was engaging with a student, and what they could hear in the background was a familial conflict situation arising, and the student was becoming more and more distressed. They could hear the narrative, they could hear the conversation, and the subsequent, our involvement was after the event. But the question was, they were worried, and they said to the student that they were working with, are you okay? And they said, no, actually, when this happens, I'm always so worried what's going to happen next. So I'm conscious that's quite an escalated situation, but might it arise? Could a circumstance happen whilst I'm within the online domain? Of course, there may be a situation that's arisen. And ultimately, what is the expectation? If something unsafe or inappropriate happens, the first thing I need to ask myself is the child safe? And am I safeguarding myself in that situation. So that's my immediacy of risk assessment. And actually, what the professional did in that situation was say to the child, tell me how you're feeling at the moment. And they said, not okay. I'm worried about what's going to happen here because I know when it reaches this point that it's not going to be a positive outcome. So you need to assess in that first instance, actually, if you believe a child or someone within that environment is at risk, you're the person, you're the professional, you need to ensure that you're taking those next steps to keep them safe in that moment, but also communicating with agencies if you need to do so. The other thing that came to mind with this scenario, Julia, is another case, and again, this was within COVID, this is where so many of our online scenarios arose, was around the sharing of information that may have been inappropriate. So through screen sharing or through messaging and inappropriate content being imparted or shared. And there's twofold to that, dealing with what the information or the image is, but also remembering that that can't be stored, backed up, retained within your device, especially if that's sensitive, inappropriate material that may be shared, even if that was unintentionally. So I think there's a number of factors that we need to consider, but always you're going back to your policy. So in this circumstance, within an online session, what does your policy outline you would do and what are the steps that you would take? And they should be clear, simple, that you could easily follow that if you needed to.
Okay, so there's so much there, and let's pull on that last point first. The policy is for me, but it's also for my clients.
Definitely.
And the client needs to read in a sentence or two that I'm so committed to this child's safety that if I'm concerned, I will phone someone. I will report this. So let's just, I think, for any sensible parent, that is a reassuring and helpful thing to read.
Yeah.
But I would also love to explore with you what could happen next. So if it was that there was an argument in the home and you were worried about domestic abuse, what would the response be in the moment and subsequently? And more importantly, how could it help the child?
Sure. So, I mean, there's a number of aspects. So we recognize that domestic abuse can be presented in so many different ways. And often the reflection is that it's physical harm that requires the response, because that's often, we can see it in the moment, we recognize it in the moment, and we've got absolute clarity for response. But we actually need to remember that emotional abuse, coercive control is actually some of the most dangerous elements of domestic abuse and some of the most common that we see on a nationwide basis. So my reflection and response to that is, how are we supporting the child? We're putting the child at the center of our decision making. If we understand and recognize that there are concerns within the environment that they reside, the law's changed. They are legally a victim if they're in a household where domestic abuse occurs. And in the first instance, if it's safe to do so, I'd be talking to the child in an open-ended way. The TED technique is what we'll be training in the inset days around tell, explain, describe, because actually context is important. We may hear something happening. So, tell me more about how you're feeling. Can you describe what happens at home? Can you explain for me what's happened in the past? And actually that's appropriate. You're not investigating, you're not interviewing, you're not making assumptive responses, but it gives you context. So the first thing is gather the context, because that will support you in identifying, do I need to act now, or actually picking up the phone tomorrow during working hours in order to have a conversation with a professional, likely to be a social care professional. Most authorities have the ability that you can have a conversation to say, this is what happened, this is what I was told, can I have a discussion with you around next steps? So you don't have to be the judge and juror. You don't have to identify what the outcome is. It's about ensuring that the child's voice is heard, that you've documented the child's exact words, that you've assessed the risk there and then. Do I need to pick up the phone because this is an escalated domestic abuse circumstance? I need to make sure the people involved are safe. Or am I able to take those next steps and seek professional advice the following day?
It's really hard talking about this stuff.
Mm,
And I admire that you do it all day long, because I have a very physical, physiological response, to thinking about a child in that heightened state of, well, it's actually fear, isn't it?
yeah. Yeah.
Is it's horrid. And I'm pointing to that feeling because I think many tutors aren't clear whether it's their place. So you said TED, tell, explain, describe. And I'm thinking, I'm not a therapist. I'm not a mum. Is it my place?
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, the TED technique isn't a therapeutic or a counseling based response. The TED technique is ensuring a child's voice is heard. So if we think about the outcomes of safeguarding practice reviews, when outcomes for children are they may have lost their lives or are significantly harmed due to abuse and neglect, the number one, you may remember the case of Victoria Colombier. She would have been in her mid-30s now. Case reviews have still mirrored the same outcomes of we fail to listen effectively to the voice of the child. If we are worried, the first person we should hear from is the child themselves. What is that child's experience at this moment in time for them? So I completely hear what you're saying. Is it our responsibility or is it our role to hear a child's voice? Yes, you're a professional, you're a trusted adult, and you may be that person at that point in time that has an insight that no one else has. Or you may have a small piece of what is a bigger picture, and your piece of the puzzle may be imperative around a wider risk assessment. So, what you're doing is not investigatory, what you're not doing is therapeutic. You're capturing the voice of the child because the welfare of the child is paramount. The child needs to be at the center of what we're doing.
Absolutely right. And I'm so glad that you gave me a resounding yes, because of course I do agree with you. And I also feel that we need to understand that if we've put ourselves in the situation of working with children, we are putting ourselves in the position of the trusted adult.
Absolutely.
Therefore, yes, it is our responsibility to respond appropriately. We are
Mhm.
not there to solve all the problems, but we must do our part.
Yeah, absolutely. So our responsibility is to recognize. So, to recognize indicators, to respond effectively. And the TED technique is an effective response. We need to be trauma informed. We need to be open ended. We then need to ensure that we report, and whether that's within our designated team structure, whether that's picking up the phone to a statutory agency, communicating with parents if it doesn't place a child at risk of harm. But finally, our record keeping. So it's the 4 R's that are the foundation, that we then record everything that has happened and every step that we have taken, and that we retain that in line with data protection
That was
guidelines.
another R there you brought in at the end, retain.
But that fifth, yeah. And I reflect,
But
that sixth R,
uh,
reflect afterwards. What would you do differently?
yes,
Yeah.
all the R's. So tell me, just tell me this. Do they help the agencies? Will it make a difference? Will they help the child?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think there's a challenge here. If I read between the lines in your question, Julia, I think actually if we hear at some of the societal reflections around statutory agencies, potentially information in the media, sometimes I get challenge and pushback around the sharing of information. But what I am absolutely clear on is that the action we take needs to have the best interests of the child in mind. So we share information in order to keep children safe. And if an outcome or next step is required, that will happen. And sometimes we share information and actually the risk is lower than we potentially anticipated because we only have this amount of information and actually there's a broader response. So does it ensure the best outcomes for children? Absolutely. And I am completely committed to those processes. Look, are they perfect? No. Are there challenges in every system and every process? Yes. But we know that the sharing of information is what safeguards children. What we don't know is when we then reach a point of risk And again, case reviews tell us children on occasions aren't known to any service. Yet when a circumstance of risk arises, then many people come forward and say, there was something really low level. I didn't know it was that. And we ask, what did you do? It's the sharing of information, that multi-agency working that keeps children safe.
I'm so glad that you had such a wholehearted answer for me. Thank you. And yeah, no, nothing's perfect, but we have to do our part in making it better. So let's
Absolutely.
move on to the third scenario. If a student says something alarming, but asks the tutor not to tell anyone, how should that be handled?
Yeah, I mean, the word alarming is interesting because, students may say a range of different things that shocks, surprises, or alarms me.
We
But
actually had a
it may,
hilarious conversation in the QT community about the things children say, and it's entertaining and shocking and everything in between.
yeah, absolutely. So, if the alarmingness around it isn't to do with safeguarding, then I'll put that to one side. I'm going to take this statement as being they've said something that alarms me and I'm worried, yet the child has said, please don't tell anyone. It's really important that nobody finds out. In that situation, what we have to be absolutely clear on, and in that moment, we must tell the student this. I'm worried about what you've just shared with me. I must ensure that I've told someone else. And the reason that I'm doing that is because I must keep you safe. And I want to be clear around what I am going to do. And sometimes in the moment, you're not going to be clear as to what you need to do because you've got to seek advice about it. I used to be a volunteer for Childline, and one of the things that was so powerful for me in almost every call that I took, children would call Childline anonymously because there weren't trusted adults that they could identify. And what you would do is work through with them, who can you turn to? I don't trust adults. Why? I told an adult something once. They said they wouldn't tell anyone and they did. I'm not telling anyone ever again. So sometimes people challenge me and say, surely I should just say I'll keep it a secret to make sure I've got the information to pass on. And my response is, no, be clear, be open, be transparent, be the adult that supports that child with honesty and integrity. And even if it's a difficult conversation, even if the child pushes back and says, I wouldn't have told you, you're acting in the best interests of the child at that point in time. And you need to be clear with them that you will be passing the information on if you are worried and why you're doing that.
And if it was that the child said, well, I'm not going to tell you then, because you're not going to promise confident, to keep it a secret. It's not the same as confidentiality, is it? It's something, it's a much less, it's a more naive approach than that. Would you say then that you could somehow respond, somehow escalate or ask for advice without actually having the information, just by knowing that the child had something that they felt they needed to say?
Yeah, I mean, without wanting to say let's role play it, Julia, but if I had the information and then they said keep it a secret, I've got the information, I'm being really clear, I can see that this is upsetting for you, but I need to be clear as to why I'm doing this, and I'm passing the information on. If the sentence started with, I'd like to tell you something, but you must promise me to keep it a secret, my immediate response is, I'm of course happy to have a conversation with you, but I need you to know if I'm worried about what you tell me and I need to tell someone to keep you safe, I will do that. And it's the child's right, it's the child's decision if they say, oh, I'm not going to tell you then. Okay, but I want you to know I'm always here and I know what to do if you are worried or there is something that needs to happen to keep you safe. So at any point, if you want to have that conversation, you let me know and we will ensure that that conversation happens. So what's really important is that you are clear. And again, people say to me, oh, I'm really uncomfortable. I just want to say, I'll keep it a secret so then I'll know. And actually, children need to have trust in the adults around them. They need to understand what a professional, trusted adult is. And that is the expected response. So what might I do then? I mean, you mentioned DSLs in school. If I've had a circumstance where actually I've observed some changes in behaviour, I've then had this conversation, I've got a nagging doubt, I'd speak to the DSL within my organisation or potentially a DSL if I've got school connections. So if there's an appropriate information sharing avenue, within an organization that that child is connected and I am connected with, then that's appropriate, because it may just be that, can I give you the heads up? This
Yeah.
happened. I don't have any context, but I just want you to know, because there's obviously something that we may need to be aware of. And what that does is heighten vigilancy.
Absolutely. And I think that that's, bringing in other trusted adults around the child who have more context, especially when you're an online tutor. It can feel very, almost genuinely two-dimensional. You sort of worry that you don't have enough context. You're not working in partnership with the other adults in the child's life. And therefore reminding us that, yes, you can go and say to somebody else who sees the child on a daily basis, you might want to just pay attention here. Yeah.
Don't
But
have
I did get
context.
that feeling as you described the scenario to me. And I really feel like I'm living them as you're describing them. I really felt worried that I was leaving the child in a situation of danger.
Yeah.
If I wasn't going to make the promises that they wanted me to make.
Yeah. So the other extension that I would add to that is, if they're not happy to talk to me today, that's absolutely their choice. But I'd also ask them to reflect upon who are other trusted adults that you can talk to. So when we finished our session today, if you needed to talk to someone, who would you turn to? And, hopefully they're going to talk about perhaps family members, perhaps teachers, there's a range of trusted adults. But the other service that I would always promote to children is the NSPCC. So it may be that I'm just saying, I'm going to give you the number, actually give them the web address, because Childline now operates more online than they do on the phone. Who picks up the phone now to have a conversation? They're doing it via the
My
web.
mom.
Yeah, yeah. But definitely not calling Childline. But yeah, so, I'd also leave them with services to say, I'm just going to pop you this information. I'm just going to leave that with you, that should you need to speak to someone when we're not in session, that you know who you can reach out to. So you're also empowering children and giving them the tools. And the brilliant part of Childline is it's anonymous. It's the only service on a national basis for children that is completely anonymized, that they can pick up the phone, talk about what they are concerned about, and be supported by a trained professional within that NSPCC environment.
I find that really helpful. And I also find it helpful to hear that you were a volunteer at Childline, because it's sort of, again, it gives me more context. It gives me more sense of, you're actually giving me a lot of hopeful feeling in this conversation, which is lovely, because safeguarding often leaves you feeling quite the opposite, doesn't it? So let's move on to the moving forward, and maybe you can respond to that with this question, which is, what can tutors expect from the safeguarding courses and training that you'll be delivering with us at the Inset for Tutor Days next year?
Sure. I mean, Julia, hopefully we've given a bit of an insight into that as we're talking through today. And I want to pick up on your comment. You use the word safeguarding and people feel daunted. And actually, I can see the faces when people come to training that they're thinking, I don't know what to expect. This is going to be really challenging. And by the end, people aren't going because they've got questions, they're ignited, they've got thoughts. So what can people expect? What you can expect is an engaging, empowering, high quality training experience. You're not going to be done to. This is about working with you to ensure that you are safeguarding the students you work with, and you're keeping yourself safe as well. And I think the other important thing to mention is we need to ensure it's clear, and we need to simplify it. So what we do is understand the legislation, read all the guidance documents, take that information and impart it to you in a way that's accessible, in a way that is simplified, that you can say, okay, what I need to do in this circumstance is this. People often say to me at the end of my training, Nicole, I come with a blank sheet of paper and I always leave with a list, but that list makes me feel confident. I leave going, I understand what I need to do now. So it's not an overwhelming list. It's okay, I'm clear on what I need to do to ensure that I have met what's needed in my safeguarding environment. So yeah, that's what we're aiming to achieve.
That's really exciting, and I'm clarity is a consistent theme with you, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which is so awesome. Now we only have 6 minutes, and I do have another couple of questions. I'm
Sure.
just going to drop this in because I think it's really important. If you have 20 people at a safeguarding training, somebody in the room is likely to have had a safeguarding experience themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, child abuse is so prevalent that it is likely that somebody in the room is going to have had an experience, a detrimental experience. So how do you ensure that the participants in your training feel safe themselves?
I mean, I'm going to extend that and say it won't be one person in 20. So the partners that we work with, such as NAPAC, so NAPAC is the counselling service that supports survivors of childhood abuse in adulthood. They estimate that 1 in 4 adults living in England are likely to have suffered some form of abuse, neglect, or exploitation within their own childhood. So, Julia, I'm aware daily I will be communicating with individuals who are likely to be victim survivors, or perhaps even in their adulthood. We talked about domestic abuse, safeguarding areas we deliver on. Maybe someone's experience today may also be that circumstance. So there's a couple of elements for me. We always ensure those support mechanisms are available, and that's available from the outset and clarified. The second thing is, we invite people and give them permission that if you need to take a breather, if you need to step away from your screen, that's absolutely appropriate to do so. Today, when we're delivering training to you as a professional, our paramount concern is your well-being. So if you need to take that space, you recognise when and where that is. We also ensure we have trigger warnings. There's particular elements of our course that are more challenging than others. And if we're exploring a specific topic area, we ensure that that warning is given, that we have clarity around what's being covered, but also ensuring that following sessions, people are clear as to the avenues of support that they're able to undertake. Because actually, often the resonance and the impact of training happens in the days and weeks after. It may not be during the training where the impact is felt. We recognise that resonance is thereafter. So providing people with a safe environment, providing people with the tools around the response mechanism. And also, the training isn't designed to create a shock factor. This isn't about providing information that makes people feel uncomfortable. There's an element around clarity. There's an element around ensuring the information is simplified, but also that the information is empowering. Actually, we shouldn't leave people feeling uncomfortable or vulnerable based on what we shared. We need you to recognise, and you'll only do that if you're empowered by the information that you hear.
Oh, fantastic. Because otherwise you're running away from the information, and that's not going to help keep children safe. I think you mentioned once somebody who was using in their promotional material a picture of a crying child or well, that's not how we do it, is it?
Yeah, that's not helpful.
It's not helpful. So thank you. I'm so glad you brought that wisdom. Last question. What one safeguarding habit would you love every tutor to adopt?
Keep safeguarding alive. And what I mean by that is safeguarding isn't a one-time task. It's not my annual training, update my policy, change the footer of the date, and then I'm good to go. So actually, safeguarding is about being curious and alert each and every day. And you mentioned earlier, you do training and you're at a heightened state of alert. But actually, what I need you to be is curiously alert every day, not in a heightened state of this could be happening anywhere, actually just recognizing I'm confident and I would know how to respond. So believe it could happen here. When complacency sets in, that's when we miss opportunity to respond. So have your foundations. This isn't a one-time task. We need to continuously be curious at all times. And if we hold that at the fore of our minds, we will safeguard our students effectively. So keep it alive would be my habit.
Keep safeguarding alive is a fantastic place to wrap up this conversation. I'm so excited about this partnership. I hope you are as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I look forward to seeing you again at the first Inset for Tutors Day. I will post the time and date and all of those sensible things. But in the meantime, thank you so much, Nicole. Thanks so much for engaging with tutoring at this level and for partnering with us on providing safeguarding training for tutors.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me today. Happy World Tutors Day.
Happy World Tutors Day. All the best. Bye.
Bye.